Thank you, Barry. I'll start my introduction whilst I attempt to share my screen. Hopefully that did work. So my name is Martha. I don't know if it's a coincidence that both presenters' first name starts with M-A-R, but it sounds good for marketing. So who am I and why am I interested in value? So I'm originally from Mexico, where I studied industrial and systems engineering. There is the first time that I learned about Lean Six Sigma. So of course, whenever you're talking about lean and you're talking about removing waste, the counterpart of that is where the value is. So I started asking myself questions around value back then. Then I came to the UK and I joined Accenture. So I started my career in management consulting. So you're always very conscious of how much value you're delivering for the client, because you have to measure how much time you allocated, which is effort, but they measure your objectives based on value. So very early on in my career, I started questioning the value that I was delivering. Later on, I moved on to financial services, where I discovered Agile. And of course, all of us who are Agilists understand the importance when you look at the principles and the values in the Agile Manifesto. Value is the centerpiece. So delivering small chunks of value frequently is what we want. And thanks to Pat for that intro. Don't know if he set the bar a bit high, but yeah, that's exactly the question that I've been asking myself, not specifically in my current job, but throughout my professional career. So in management consulting, I work for most big UK banks. Then I moved on to Santander, and most recently, I'm working at DB. I've been the head of change within risk management for the last almost 3 years now. And I would like to commence by stating that this presentation that I will share, the paradox of measuring value in the workplace, is not inspired specifically by any of my previous clients or current employers. It is a compilation of the knowledge that I have gathered whilst asking myself these questions. So in my quiet times during this lockdown, I took the opportunity to sit down and, using NLP slang, neuro-linguistic programming, thinking what is my map of the world to explain what value is, how it's delivered at work, and how could we possibly measure it. So that's what led me to think, oh, actually there's a paradox, because this is quite complicated. So I'm very much looking forward to sharing that with you today. And hopefully you'll get out of this the following learning outcomes. So first off, I'll cover what's the importance and the challenges of measuring value in the workplace. Pat already highlighted some of them. Then I will share how I articulated that paradox. And my hope is that when I present the model that I have created, which again is my map of the world for value, you might have different ones. You might find it helpful and use it as a guide when determining how to measure value in your own job. But that's a big task, because it's difficult to find a blanket approach or model that can be suitable for every type of job across every industry. But let's try. And finally, the takeaway would be for you to think if it's possible to measure value within your job or not. And the answer might vary by attendee. So here we go. So the agenda completely aligns with the learning outcomes, but what I would like to highlight is that I have color-coded this. So in white, white font for the title is information. In yellow is a question that I would like to pose. This will be a rhetorical question. If you have a burning desire to share the answer, you're very welcome to do that using the chat box, but it's to keep you engaged and for you to question my model. You're very welcome to contact me after or during the questions to tell me if you have a better way or a different application of it. And in red, I highlighted the challenges, and throughout the presentation, you'll see my little drops of wisdom of where the light bulb got switched on and how it gave me an idea to produce my value model. And at the end, I'll show how everything comes together. So let's start. why are we bothering with this topic? So I heard this quote that has not attributed an author. So we measure value because what we cannot measure, we cannot. So this is a question. They sometimes attribute this statement to Deming, and many people say control. So you measure for you to control things. But in the Agile community at work, they shared with me, well, we're moving into servant leadership. So maybe manage is a better word. Control is very command and control. So if we're Agilists, yeah, we measure because we want to manage things, and that could imply monitoring, improving it, and maybe you can come up with an other category, maybe innovation. So if you don't measure it, you cannot manage it. That's the first part of it. And maybe moving into something a bit softer, have you ever thought that what we measure impacts our culture? I don't know if you have, if you're familiar with Eli Goldratt, he has amazing quotes, but I came across this one. Tell me how you measure me, and I will tell you how I will behave. That is so true. If I start measuring my team by the number of hours that they spend online, well, behold and be surprised that people will start only focusing on how many hours they're in front of the computer and not that much on the quality of their deliverables. If I start measuring how many reports they produce, the number of reports will go up. But if I start measuring how much value the reports add to facilitate decision making, maybe I'll drive a different behavior. And sadly, the truth that also applies for more negative behavior. So I don't know if you're familiar with the second part of this quote. It goes, if you measure me in an illogical way, don't complain about illogical behavior. So that's why we should be careful about what we measure, because it impacts our culture. And before we move on, I thought it would be helpful to go back to basics. So when I say value, what do I mean throughout this presentation? So I used Wikipedia and Wiktionary just to make sure that it was available to everyone. So value is a measure of a benefit that might be gained from goods or service, whilst effort is the work involving performing an activity. So value is something you gained, and effort is something you give away. So another question. So we know what value is, but how familiar are you with the measures that are currently used? So I have gathered this from my professional experience. How many of this, there's 10, do you think regard effort, and how many do you think regard value? So examples are like number of closed IT tickets, number of produced reports, number of completed milestones. So hold that number in your head. Drum roll, my answer is there's 0 metrics that regard value. All of them regard effort. So let me just explain a few. If I'm focusing on a team that makes calls for sales, the number of calls they made is just the effort, because that call might not have resulted in any sales. So therefore, I'm not measuring value for the organization. If I'm measuring the number of open audit findings, I'm just measuring the effort. I'm not measuring how have I changed the processes in order for them to align with what is deemed by the regulator as best practice. So because of that, I find it difficult for people to truly measure value, because the first thing you deal with when you take on a new job is you have to report on this type of metrics that focus on effort and not on value. So let's try to focus on value, because this is the presentation of today. So I don't know what you're familiar with on types of value. Usually most people attribute to value financial things. So for instance, profit, yeah, that's a type of value. Cost reduction, return of investment is not the cost savings, but the money I will get in the future, or just revenue that will then lead to profit. So all of them are interconnected. Hopefully you know that there's so much more. I haven't found one list that every single author refers to, but this is my compilation. So risk reduction, I currently work in risk, so for me that one is quite important. Regulatory compliance, if you're in financial services, that is one that comes back, like the value is just complying with the regulator. Customer satisfaction, if you're in services, that's quite important. That is usually measured through surveys. And most recently, social responsibility. A product would have more value if it has a lower carbon footprint. Employee satisfaction, employees are now looking at how happy their employees are, and they measure that with surveys as well. But what about knowledge? That's a very agile angle. Like maybe you won't get money and you might not be happy, but just knowing that something worked or didn't, that holds some value. And then finally, I brought in innovation. That's also something that is more proactive rather than reactive, and it's often seen as a type of luxury, depending on what industry you work in. So this leads me to the first challenge, because as you can see, there are too many types of value to measure. And as I mentioned before, there is no agreed scope, no agreed definition, and no agreed form of measurement, other than those financial ones that could be done to currency, euros, dollars, pounds. So this gives me an idea, going back to the model. It should be possible that all these value types create some sort of synergy rather than competing with each other. Because if you try to select the most important type of value, your head might start hurting. So now let's think of who benefits from these types of value. So again, rhetorical question, pick a letter that you like. Is this more focused on the customer, stakeholder, team, vendor, community? Is it all of them or none of them? Or you'll take the Agilist response and go, it depends. So I'm hoping no one said none of them. That's the only answer that wouldn't be correct. Depending on where you work, what your job is, what part of the organization you focus on, you could have any option between A and H. So if you didn't answer G, I'm with you. But that poses the second challenge. Various value beneficiaries are working in silos to measure value. So that leads to different definitions of value and diverse views on the role of value for decision making. So an idea. My model had to measure value in a holistic way, because if we go down the silo route, things get complicated and murky and non-standardized. So in order to prioritize where I had to start my model, I asked myself, okay, so what would be the ultimate value type? I gave you loads of examples for value types. So I did some research, and of course, Eli Goldratt came up again. I don't know if you read his book, The Goal, but there he says that the goal is to make money for an organization. So if the goal is to make money, he then says, an action that moves us towards making money is productive, and an action that takes away from making money is non-productive. So I followed that line of thought to create my first version of this model. Again, my background is in Lean Six Sigma, so I started with a process approach, input, process, outcome, and then the goal. So the closest value type was return of investment, and then I kind of created a story on the timeline. So say I bring in employees that have a certain degree of knowledge, skill set, and an attitude towards innovation. Then I have my process that will have some controls for risk reduction and for compliance with the regulator. Then I produce an outcome that will either lead to cost reduction, revenue, profit, or at least customer satisfaction, you would hope. And then the employees, not just the millennial ones, but I'm sure that everyone could relate to, yay, if the customer is satisfied and my organization is making money, I'm happy. And additionally, if you see that there's a positive impact into social responsibility, it creates a bit of a virtuous cycle. So I was like, yep, this could work. And then I looked again at return of investment, and I wonder, this is too linear. It cannot work. What if I'm a startup and I choose to reinvest the money that I got? So then we go back into Agile, an iterative process. So with that in mind, hopefully you're as ambitious as I am, and you thought we can do better. That cannot be our model for value. But the challenge number 3 that I focused was the time dimension. So I realized that whilst I was trying to follow the Agile principle of simplicity, the previous model was oversimplifying it. And the reason for that is because I didn't consider time. So there could be a value type that is very important in the short term, and there could be another value type that would only become important in the long term. So how could I include that into the model? So that level of complexity had to lead into my model being multi-dimensional. So hopefully you're visual like I am, because when I depicted it this way, things started becoming more clear. So I started with the input process output, which is just linear. So I was, the value model is not a value chain. At the end, I included that loop for iterative process, but it was still too plain, oversimplified. So value cycle is not the model I'm looking for. And now that I'm thinking about time, I was like, oh, maybe it's like a spiral. So the product that was amazing 50 years ago is too plain today. So it's like this parallel universe that when time passes by, expectations are different, things keep changing. So maybe it's like a spiral. However, going back to this complexity, that didn't seem to be enough, because even if I consider that strand on its own, things are way more complex. So think about your organization. There's one team that could be producing value, but that output is the input to another team. So how could I depict this visually? And that's when I got an idea, going back to my uni days of industrial and systems engineering. The systems bit was systems thinking. So who says university doesn't work? So I was like, I need to tap into systems thinking to wrap up my model. So that's when I thought, okay, so it is not just one spiral considering time, there's a few of them. And with systems thinking, those subsystems are part of another system. So the value system has to focus on the whole organization. So with that in mind, we arrive to the climax of this presentation, which is the paradox of measuring value. I don't know if you're all familiar with that term. There's many different types of paradoxes. The one that I consider the most exciting one is the one that focuses on something that appears to be illogical, but the second you look into the detail, it makes sense, and it appears that that illogical statement is actually very logical. So here we go. The more effort measuring the value of the parts, the less accuracy in measuring the value of the whole. So this is counterintuitive and seems to be logical, because if you think, oh, if I put all this effort to understand every single part, then I'll be able to understand the whole. But that is the same as analyzing a body, looking at the arms and the legs and the core separately. But when it comes together, that's where the whole becomes more powerful than the parts. So by analyzing value separately, we're missing out on that synergy. So I hope I haven't made your head hurt. Another way that I found to explain this was actually in the Cambridge Dictionary. So when I looked up the word measure, I found that there are about 11 different definitions for it, but these two really caught my eye because I feel that they exemplify my paradox for measuring value. So what do you think it's a more agile definition for measure? One, to discover the exact size or amount of something, or two, to judge the quality, effect, importance, or value of something. So I think that this actually links to what Pat was saying, as in we really struggle to measure value. It's like, I think so if you're following the first definition. So if you're trying to measure the exact size of something, like how many reports did you produce, how much money did you earn, how much time, how many man hours, how many FTEs, that becomes so complicated and you stop seeing the big picture. But if we follow the second option, which I hope you identified as a more agile definition of measure, judging the quality, effect, and importance of something, I think we're on a better path to measure value. But that, of course, poses the final challenge for this model for value, which is, okay, if we're focusing on importance, that's subjective. So if I want to roll this out across the organization, how could I make sure that everyone in the organization can judge value the same way. And that's where strategy becomes relevant. So if I refer to the organization's mandate, mission, and vision, and that has been cascaded across the organization, we all speak the same language and we all value the same thing. So with no further ado, let me present my model to measure value. I structured it in a way that I include different layers. So I'll start by describing the process and giving you some examples. So again, input, those would be the resources. An example for risk would be the people, time, data, and technology. For other industries, I don't know, a bakery, consider there the ingredients that we would use and any equipment. Then we go through the process, which is the approach of method or methodology. So in risk, that would be the workflow that I would follow. For a bakery, that would be the recipe that I would follow to produce something. Then the output, that is a product, deliverable, or result. So again, in risk, that would be a risk assessment. Again, a bakery, that would be my loaf of bread. Then we move on to the outcome, and you'll see that I introduced a little ticking clock because usually there's a time lag between the output and the outcome. So let's call that a short-term objective. Again, with the example for risk, that could be risk reduction. So if I did my risk assessment correctly, I'm hoping that once I implement the recommended actions and new controls, I would see a reduction in risk, which was one of the value types that I mentioned before. For the bakery, for instance, you would expect for them to get some revenue and potentially some happy customers and some happy employees. And then outcome aggregate, which is the long-term objective, and you'll see the time icon again. So in the example of risk, I would like to see a return of investment because I had a risk reduction, then I have less losses, and therefore I have a bigger profit. So it's a return of investment. For the example of the bakery, assuming that, I don't know, they wanted to be an organic bakery, after a while of selling good quality type of bread, then they would earn the reputation of being the best value organic bakery. So the next layer that I would like to share within this model are the feedback loops that connects to the Agile principle of reflect often. So sometimes we'll get an output. It could be the risk control assessment or the piece of bread, and I could say that was actually not the right quality, so let's send it back and let's put it through the process again. If you're in software, it could be we found that there were some bugs, let's fix them. Which made me think that could also go to another part of the organization. So if it did work, then it goes, that becomes the input to another subsystem. And you could also find that there's a problem with the process. Maybe you realize that it could be more automated. So then that information would feed back as knowledge somewhere else. And the same could happen for the outcome or for the outcome aggregate. Also bear in mind that the aggregate would be using inputs from other parts of the organization. So at this point in time, the next layer is more a categorization. I would say that you could broadly categorize input and process as effort, and output, outcome, and outcome aggregate as value. So you could potentially fit that into a value type. And finally, I'm introducing that layer of strategy that I identified through my idea to address challenge number 5. So I think that we could map the mandate, what you're authorized to do. So I'm authorized to have people with this skill set to follow this process with this amount of automation or technology, and I'm authorized to produce this output. My purpose is like my mission. And my vision is, where am I going? Why am I doing this? And of course, there should be feedback loops again. So for instance, if my outcome is risk reduction, but my purpose is not to reduce risk, you would wonder, why am I doing this? At the same time, if the outcome aggregate is a return of investment, that should align to your vision. So our vision should be to be a more financially sound institution, still using that risk example. And then my vision should always link back into the purpose and the mandate should also still connect to everything. So this feedback loop allows us to address that challenge on time because things change internally and externally. And the final layer for categorization are questions. So input and process is how I deliver something. The output is what I'm delivering. And the outcome and outcome aggregate are why I'm doing this, which also align with the strategic layer. So this is the second version of my model. I've been working on it for 2 months. There's a few tweaks, but the last one I really want to highlight is something that was missing. This is only a view of the organization. And as mentioned before, if we use systems thinking and more specifically viable system theory, we would notice that all of this could be subject to change at any point in time through the larger system that this subsystem is from. An example of that would be the market. What if there's a challenger bank and they suddenly take a part of the market, they provide better technology, they innovate. So not only they can influence me, but I can influence them. And if you think that is not the case, we all are part of a larger environment, which is the world. So a great example right now is COVID. No one saw it coming, but it definitely posed a different threat that we had to adapt to and react to. So that's worth considering, and that could throw out the window all the thinking and all these cycles. So again, connecting to the paradox, just to close, where do you think most people are measuring value? Think about the questions. Where are most metrics found? Hope you remember, in my experience at least, I don't know yours, it's in effort. So again, the value of the parts. And therefore, where is best to start measuring value? So it should be more in the why. Start with why. So the value of the whole. So going back to that question, how could we measure value? We shouldn't start with the parts, we should start with the whole. But how to do that, that's very easy to say and way harder for it to be done. So I'll give you the following takeaways. There's 6 top tips from this presentation. So when I say start with the whole and then consider the parts, what I mean is look at the vision, purpose, and mandate. I was speaking with Barry and with Marcus, just on Monday, and they said, that's actually really hard. You start a new job and not every organization tells you what's the vision, what's your mandate. It's something you need to discover. So do make time to ask the question, and if it's not defined, it is a worthy exercise to define it and communicate it. Then look at the model. This is my map of the world. Maybe you would prefer something with some tweaks, but understand where your job fits within that model. So what I mean by that is not only understand where you would plot yourself, but what type of value do you deliver day in, day out? Also, how is your job connected? Who do you receive inputs from? Who do you give outputs for? And are you more focused on the value or on the effort? And how are you being currently measured? So understand where you are. And then to start measuring value properly, try to keep it simple and consider the direction of travel. So that's what I meant. Rather than focusing on the parts, it makes way more sense to start with the whole, that is systems thinking. Fourth, reconsider key value types according to the life cycle position. So going back to that loop and the factor of time, perhaps if I'm a startup, the most important thing is not for me to make a profit immediately, it's for me to gather knowledge or to make sure I build a network. And if you progress 50 years, maybe your organization would be in a position of being more focused on getting a return of investment. But if you question that, you would argue, okay, but why are you not looking at innovation? So always question it. I think play the devil's advocate. I think that always adds value. And review and communicate the vision, purpose, and mandate. Because again, things change. Like remember that red circle, if the larger system changes things, or if you change the system, maybe the vision is no longer fit for purpose and you need a more modern one. and that should be communicated, otherwise people don't know what value they're meant to be providing. And last but not least, evaluate indicators and adapt frequently, because if you're measuring a value for a value type that is no longer relevant given your life cycle position, perhaps it's a time to change it, and that's also an agile principle. So thank you so much for your attention. I think we'll take questions at the very end.